These videos are based on real events, experiences, and accounts. However, all names, locations, and identifying details have been deliberately changed to protect the privacy and safety of those involved. Viewer discretion is advised. The town was the kind of place you passed through without meaning to stay. Daniel Mercer had driven through dozens like it over the years. Storefronts boarded up with plywood gone silver from weather, a gas station that doubled as the only grocery option after 5, and streets that emptied out so completely after dark you could stand in the middle of the main road and not worry about a single headlight finding you. He wasn't there by choice. He was there because his company had a contract and his company was short on people, and Daniel was the one who answered his phone when the dispatcher called on a Tuesday afternoon and asked if he could drive 3 hours north. Daniel did commercial refrigeration work. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well and he was good at it. Walk-in freezers, industrial cooling units, the kind of machinery that hummed behind the walls of grocery stores and restaurants and kept everything running without anyone noticing until it broke. When it broke, someone like Daniel drove out to fix it. This time, it was an older, family-owned supermarket in a town called Harwick, Pennsylvania, a place that existed on maps mostly as a name between 2 larger names. He'd been told to expect 3 nights. He packed accordingly and told his neighbor to grab his mail. He arrived a little after 7 on a Thursday evening in early November. The sky had been dark for over an hour already, and the temperature had dropped sharply on the last stretch of highway. His GPS took him off the main road and down a 2-lane route lined with bare trees before depositing him at the only motel with a vacancy sign still lit. It was a single-story building, maybe 12 rooms total, with all the doors facing a cracked asphalt parking lot, the kind of place where nothing had been renovated since the early 90s. Not the signage, not the vending machine humming near the ice maker, not the rust stains running down the exterior walls beneath each window unit. Inside the office, the smell hit him first. Old coffee and something sharper underneath it, like industrial cleaner applied too liberally to a surface that had absorbed too many years of whatever came before it. A woman sat behind the front desk. She was somewhere in her 60s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a friendliness in her face that Daniel recognized as genuine but distracted. She processed his reservation without any issues, asked him how the drive had been, and slid a paper envelope across the counter with a room key inside. Then she said something that lodged in the back of his mind even though he tried to let it go. She told him in a voice that was almost casual that if anyone knocked on his door during the night, he shouldn't answer it unless it was her or the owner. And if he heard anything unusual outside, he should call the office rather than get involved himself. Daniel paused. He asked if the area had a problem with crime. She shook her head slightly and said it was nothing like that, just some drifters who came through occasionally and bothered guests for money. She said it with the tone of someone offering directions. Matter-of-fact, unhurried, like it was simply part of the check-in information and no more alarming than pointing out where the ice machine was. He thanked her and walked to his room. It was near the far end of the building, second to last. Clean enough when he stepped inside, though the carpet had dark spots that didn't come out with any amount of cleaning, and the dresser was scarred with old cigarette burns along the edge. He dropped his bag, changed his boots, and drove back down to the gas station for food because nothing else was open. He was back by 8. That was when he noticed the truck. It was parked 2 spaces from his, a dark green pickup, older model, engine running but headlights off. Daniel noticed it as he was walking from his car to his room. He couldn't see the driver's face clearly in the dark, but the man's posture caught his attention in a way he couldn't quite name. Most people, when someone walks past them in a parking lot, glance over instinctively. It's just something humans do. This man didn't. He sat with both hands resting on the steering wheel, facing forward, completely still, like a photograph of a man sitting in a truck rather than an actual person. Daniel told himself the man was waiting for someone. He went inside. He ate his gas station sandwich, watched videos on his phone for an hour, and showered before 10. He was in bed by 10:30 with the lamp off and the television on low. Outside, the parking lot was quiet. The room to his left was occupied. He'd seen a light under the door on his way in. The room to his right appeared dark and empty. He was close to sleep when he heard the footsteps. They came from outside, slow and unhurried, along the concrete walkway that ran the length of the building in front of all the doors. Daniel didn't react at first. Other guests walked back and forth at all hours. That was just part of staying somewhere like this. But then the steps slowed. Then they stopped, directly outside his door. He lay still and listened. No knock came, no key rattled in the room next door. The steps simply stopped, and the silence that replaced them was the kind that had a weight to it. Daniel counted in his head without meaning to. Somewhere around 15 seconds, the footsteps moved on down the walkway. He exhaled. Then, less than a minute later, they came back, moving slowly from the other direction, stopping again at exactly the same place, right outside his door. The same silence, the same stillness on the other side of a few inches of hollow core wood. Then, the steps moved away again. Daniel got up quietly and crossed to the door. He pressed one eye to the peephole. The walkway outside was dim under the orange glow of a single parking lot light, but it was empty in both directions. No one was visible. He stood there longer than made sense, looking at nothing. He went back to bed and told himself it was someone who had too much to drink and couldn't find their room. He told himself that for the next 20 minutes, lying in the dark with his eyes open, listening to a parking lot that had gone completely silent. The knock came a little after 11. Daniel had been drifting, not fully asleep, but in that shallow, unreliable place between awareness and rest, where sounds arrive distorted and the brain takes a moment too long to process them. 2 sharp raps on the door pulled him back completely. He lay still for a moment, waiting. Then they came again. The exact same rhythm, the exact same pressure. Not the knock of someone impatient or drunk, deliberate, measured, like it had been practiced. He got up without turning on the lamp and crossed the room in the dark. He leaned close to the peephole and looked out. The walkway was empty. Not empty in the way it might be if someone had knocked and walked off. Empty in the immediate sense, like whoever had been standing there had simply ceased to exist between the moment of the knock and the moment Daniel reached the door. The orange light from the parking lot lay across the concrete in the same dull stripe it always did. Nothing moved. No figure retreating down the walkway, no shadow pulling back around the corner of the building. Just stillness. His stomach dropped in a way that was different from before. The earlier footsteps could be rationalized. A wrong room, a confused guest, the ordinary strangeness of sharing a building with strangers. But a knock with nobody there afterward, that wasn't confusion. That was intention. Someone had knocked and moved before he could see them, which meant they understood exactly how long it would take him to reach the door. He stood at the peephole for a long time, seeing nothing. Then he checked the deadbolt, even though he already knew it was locked, turned it anyway, and stepped back. That was when he noticed the curtain near the window. It had shifted, just slightly. Not enough that he would have caught it immediately, but enough that a thin gap now existed between the curtain's edge and the window frame. It hadn't been that way when he came in. He was certain of it, because he remembered pulling the curtain flush when he first arrived, the way he always did in unfamiliar rooms. Someone outside adjusting something near the window ledge could have disturbed it. Someone leaning close enough to look through it could have disturbed it too. He moved the curtain shut and turned off the lamp entirely. Then he sat on the edge of the bed in complete darkness and listened. For 30 minutes, nothing happened. The parking lot stayed quiet. The room next door produced the faint, ordinary sounds of someone sleeping, the creak of a bed frame and the low murmur of a television. Daniel was starting to believe, cautiously, that whatever had been happening was finished for the night, when he heard the new sound. It was subtle enough that he almost convinced himself it was something mechanical, the building settling, a pipe cooling somewhere in the walls. But it came again, and he placed it clearly. A light scraping of metal against metal, coming from just outside the door. Not a key, something thinner, more deliberate, moving with a patience that was worse than urgency. He moved to the door without making a sound and pressed his eye to the peephole for the 3rd time that night. This time, there was someone there. The figure was crouched low, almost below the natural line of the peephole's view, which is why Daniel nearly missed him. What he could see was the top of a dark baseball cap and one shoulder of a jacket. The person was close to the door, close enough that Daniel could see the slight movement of their arm working at something near the handle or the lock plate. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He stood there with his eye pressed to that small circle of glass, watching a stranger crouch at his door in the dark, and he counted the seconds because it was the only thing that kept his mind from going somewhere worse. It couldn't have been more than 5 seconds before the figure stood abruptly and moved, fast. The footsteps went hard and quick toward the far end of the building, and then silence swallowed them. Daniel called the office. The woman who answered sounded half asleep and mildly annoyed until she told him what he'd seen. Then she went quiet in a way that told her more than her words did. She asked if he had opened the door at any point. He said no. She told him to stay inside and said the owner would check the lot. 2 minutes later, headlights swept slowly across his curtains as a car moved through the parking lot. Then they disappeared. When the office called back, the woman said no one was out there now and it was probably just someone causing trouble. Daniel asked if he should call the police. She said it wouldn't do much good unless the person came back. He didn't sleep. He lay in the dark with his clothes still on and listened to every sound the building and the lot produced for the rest of the night. Around 3 a.m, his body gave up and pulled him under, but it was shallow and unreliable, and at 5:15 he was jolted awake by the sound of his truck's door alarm chirping from the parking lot. He was at the window in seconds, holding the curtain back just enough to see out. There was a man at the driver's side of his truck. Tall, dark jacket, dark hat, his back partly turned. The door was halfway open. As Daniel watched, the man turned his head and looked directly toward Daniel's room, not scanning the building generally, not glancing around the lot, but looking at that specific window with the specific attention of someone who already knew exactly where to look. Then he shut the truck door and walked off at a fast pace toward the road that ran behind the motel, disappearing into the gray pre-dawn dark without looking back. The police came 15 minutes later. They were thorough enough, took a report, checked the truck, noted that nothing had been stolen. One of the officers asked if Daniel was sure he'd locked the vehicle, and Daniel felt the particular exhaustion of being doubted when he was already exhausted. He knew he'd locked it. He locked it every single time, everywhere he went, out of nothing more than habit. The older of the two officers seemed to take the rest of it more seriously. He asked the motel owner about security cameras. There was one in the office and one covering the front entrance, nothing covering the far end of the lot where Daniel's room sat. Before they left, the older officer told him that if anything else happened, he should not open his door for any reason, and that he should leave as early in the morning as he could manage. Daniel worked his full shift at the supermarket that day, running on no sleep and bad gas station coffee, and when he returned to the motel that evening, the woman at the desk looked at his face and immediately offered to move him to room 2, close to the office. He asked her why she hadn't offered that the night before. She said she hadn't thought it was necessary. Then she added something quietly, almost to herself, as if she hadn't fully decided to say it out loud until it was already out. She said it usually didn't happen 2 nights in a row. Daniel asked what that meant. She pulled back immediately, said she'd misspoken, said the drifters usually moved on after a single night. But the way she corrected herself, too quickly, too smoothly, told him that wasn't a slip of the tongue. That was something she knew and had been careful not to say. He should have left. He knew that, sitting in the parking lot, bone-tired and smelling like machinery, watching the same dark green pickup cruise slowly through the lot that evening, with its headlights off and its engine barely audible. It rolled past his room, turned near the road, and parked at the far end with a clear line of sight to his door. He called the office. The owner answered this time and told him flatly that as long as the truck wasn't blocking anyone in, there wasn't much to be done. When Daniel asked if he recognized it, the man said only, "People come and go." What followed that second night was worse than the first in every way that mattered. The tapping came at the window. Then something, a fingernail, a key, something thin and deliberate, dragged slowly down the glass from top to bottom. Daniel lay in bed and didn't move. Then the bathroom window began to rattle. Then the sound he would remember longest, the door of the empty room beside his opening. Not forced, not loud, just the quiet, practiced sound of a lock being worked open by someone who understood locks. Movement next door, cautious and light. A single hard knock against the shared wall behind his headbed, testing it. Then silence so complete it pressed against his ears. Then his own bathroom window started to move. He ran to it and shoved it shut with both hands. Something on the other side pushed back once, measured, unhurried, like it was simply establishing whether he was paying attention. He locked the flimsy latch and backed away and called 911, whispering everything to the dispatcher while movement gathered outside his front door and soft knocks came again, patient as ever. When the police arrived and their headlights swept the lot, he heard running, at least 2 sets of feet, maybe more, disappearing fast into the darkness behind the building. The officers found the window screen in the bushes, removed cleanly, fresh pry marks on his truck door, fresh pry marks on the door of the empty room next to his. The older officer from that morning came back and spoke to Daniel privately. He told him they had seen the green pickup before. In the past 6 months, 2 other men, both traveling alone for work, both staying at this same motel, had reported similar incidents. One had heard movement outside his room and left without filing a formal report. The other had woken to find his room door cracked open, the lock defeated, though nothing inside had been touched. The officer said they believed a group had been following out-of-town men from job sites and waiting until they were isolated before attempting to get inside. He never specified what he believed the intended outcome was. He didn't need to. Daniel packed his bag while 2 officers stood outside his door. Before he zipped the bag shut, he dropped his phone charger and knelt to retrieve it. That was when he saw it, a small folded square of newspaper pushed almost completely against the far wall under the bed. He unfolded it. On the back, written in pen, his room number, his truck's license plate number, written in someone's handwriting, deliberate and unhurried. He hadn't been chosen at random. He had been watched closely enough, long enough for someone to write those details down and slide them beneath his bed without him knowing. He checked out before 1 a.m. and drove nearly 2 hours home without stopping. His company sent someone else to finish the job the following week, and that person stayed in a different town entirely. Daniel never went back to Harwick. He never talks about it often, but sometimes in parking lots of unfamiliar motels, he finds himself scanning the cars before he gets out of his truck, looking for dark green pickups idling with their headlights off and for men who don't turn their heads when someone walks past. Sarah Ellison downloaded the app on a Sunday night in October, mostly because her friend Dana had spent the better part of dinner telling her she needed to stop waiting for something to happen and start making it happen herself. Sarah was 26, recently out of a 2-year relationship that had ended quietly and without drama, and she had reached that particular phase of singleness where the solitude had stopped feeling like freedom and started feeling like furniture she kept bumping into in the dark. So she made a profile, uploaded 3 photos she didn't hate, wrote a short bio that she revised 4 times before deciding the first version was fine, and started swiping. She wasn't expecting much. She told herself that clearly and often during the first few days. Dating apps had a reputation, and she wasn't naive about it. Most matches went nowhere. Most conversations died after 3 exchanges. She swiped with the detached curiosity of someone browsing a menu at a restaurant they'd never tried before, not particularly hungry but willing to be surprised. The surprise came on a Wednesday. His name was Ryan Cole. His profile showed a man in his late 20s with dark hair and a straightforward smile, not the kind of overly posed, filtered photo that immediately signaled effort in the wrong direction, just a normal picture of a normal-looking person standing outside somewhere with good light. His bio was short. He was in the military, stationed at a base about 40 miles from Sarah's apartment. He liked hiking and bad action movies and had a dog named Biscuit, whose photo took up half his profile. Sarah swiped right mostly because of the dog. He matched her within minutes and opened the conversation himself, which she appreciated. They talked that evening for 2 hours without either of them noticing the time passing. He was easy to talk to in the way that felt rare, not performing, not running through a checklist of impressive things to mention, just genuinely engaged in whatever she said and honest about his own life in a way that felt natural rather than calculated. He'd grown up in rural Virginia, joined the military at 19, had been stationed at his current base for 8 months and didn't know many people outside of work. He asked her questions and actually listened to the answers. When she made a joke, he laughed without overselling it. By the end of that first week, they were talking every day, morning through evening, the conversation moving seamlessly between text and voice notes and the occasional video call. Sarah found herself looking forward to her phone in a way she hadn't in a long time. She was careful not to read too much into it, careful to remind herself that the version of a person that exists in a phone screen is always cleaner and more manageable than the version that exists in actual physical space. But she couldn't pretend she wasn't enjoying it. Then, somewhere in the third week, something shifted. It happened gradually enough that she almost didn't notice it at first, the way a temperature drop in autumn can go unfelt until you're suddenly cold and can't remember exactly when it started. Ryan began texting more frequently, and the tone of his messages began to change in ways that were subtle but cumulative. He started using possessive language that Sarah initially read as affectionate, phrases like "my girl" and "you're mine" that she might have let pass as the kind of over-eager warmth some people expressed in early attraction, but they came more frequently and with more weight behind them, more certainty, less warmth. Then, one evening, after she mentioned she'd had dinner with a male colleague from work, his response made the temperature drop another 10 degrees. He asked who the man was, how she knew him, how long they'd been working together, and whether they'd ever been alone before. The questions came quickly, stacked on top of each other, and when Sarah answered them honestly and calmly, his response was a long silence followed by a single message that she read twice to make sure she'd understood it correctly. He wrote that she was his and that if he couldn't have her, no one else would either. Sarah stared at her phone screen for a long moment. She typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on something neutral, something designed to de-escalate without confirming or denying anything, the instinctive language of someone who has registered danger and is quietly buying time. She told herself it was just words. She told herself people said dramatic things when they were developing feelings for someone and didn't know how to manage them. She told herself a lot of things over the next few days, and she believed almost none of them. Over the following week, the messages darkened further. He told her that if she ever blocked him or unfriended him on any platform, she would regret it. He said it plainly, without elaboration, which made it worse than if he'd described it in detail. Explicit threats have edges you can examine and argue against. This was smooth and flat and left no room for reinterpretation. Sarah screenshotted everything and said nothing to him that might escalate it further. She was managing him at that point. She understood that clearly, even if she hadn't said it out loud to anyone yet. Then, one morning in early December, he unfriended her on Snapchat without a word. No explanation, no final message, no dramatic exit. He was simply gone from her contacts list, as though he'd never been there. Sarah waited for a follow-up that didn't come, and then, carefully and with the specific relief of someone who doesn't fully trust their own luck, she exhaled and tried to move forward. She didn't delete the screenshots. She kept them in a folder on her phone without entirely understanding why, the way you keep a receipt for something you hope you'll never need to return. 8 weeks passed. She stopped thinking about him every day, then every few days, then almost not at all. She went back to her ordinary life, work, friends, the small reliable rhythms of a Tuesday evening and a Saturday morning. She did not re-download the app. She did not talk about Ryan Cole to most people because there was nothing concrete enough to talk about. Nothing had technically happened. A man had said frightening things over text and then disappeared. That was the whole story, or so she believed. Then his name appeared in her notifications again. Ryan Cole has added you on Snapchat. Sarah sat with her phone in her hand and felt the specific chill of something she'd hoped was finished making clear that it wasn't finished at all. She thought about ignoring it. She thought about blocking him immediately. Then she thought about what he had written 8 weeks ago, that if she blocked him, she would regret it, and fear made the decision before logic could catch up.
She accepted the request. His first message arrived within seconds.
The message read, "I've been thinking about your smile for 8 weeks. I keep wondering what we could have been if I hadn't let my dark thoughts win." Sarah read it standing in her kitchen with her coffee going cold on the counter beside her. She read it twice, then set her phone face down and stood there for a moment looking at nothing in particular. The message was designed to sound like remorse. It had the shape of an apology and the texture of vulnerability, and under any other circumstances from any other person, it might have landed that way. But Sarah knew what had preceded it. She had the screenshots. She knew exactly what his dark thoughts looked like when he stopped editing them, and they looked nothing like the careful, soft-edged sentence he had just sent her. She typed back, "That's cute." 2 words, neutral, non-committal, a closed door left slightly ajar rather than slammed shut. She had made a calculation and she understood it clearly. Engaging him was frightening, but disappearing on him was more frightening still. So she engaged, carefully, the way you might move through a room you suspect has a weak floor, testing each step before committing your full weight to it. They fell back into conversation, but it was different this time. Sarah was different this time. Before, she had been genuinely present in the exchange, actually curious about him, actually enjoying it. Now she was performing presence while remaining entirely elsewhere, watching the conversation from a slight remove, the way you watch something on a screen rather than through a window. She responded when she needed to. She kept her answers short and warm enough to satisfy without giving him anything real to hold on to. But Ryan had changed too, and not in the direction she might have hoped. The possessiveness that had emerged gradually in October arrived fully formed this time, with no warm-up period and no pretense of the easy friendliness that had characterized the beginning. He asked where she was throughout the day. He asked who she was with. He told her to turn on her location sharing on Snapchat so he could make sure she was safe. And when she told him her phone's battery was low and she had forgotten to turn the feature on, he asked again the next day and the day after that. The requests had the persistence of someone who understood that repetition eventually produces compliance. Sarah said nothing about any of this to Ryan. She said quite a lot about it to her best friend, James, who listened with increasing alarm over 2 weeks of careful, quiet conversations in his car or at his kitchen table, places where Sarah felt like she could speak at full volume without something hearing her. On a Thursday evening in late November, Sarah spent several hours driving around with James, neither of them with any particular destination, just the specific comfort of movement and familiar company in the inside of a car with the heat on. It was close to 1 in the morning when she finally asked him to drop her home. He pulled up at the end of her street. They said their goodbyes, and she walked up the narrow alleyway that ran alongside her building toward the rear entrance she always used. She registered the figure standing in the alleyway before she understood what she was seeing. A man, standing still in the dark near the far wall. She noted him the way you note any unexpected person in a space where you expected to be alone, with a quick internal adjustment that wasn't quite alarm yet, just heightened attention. She kept walking. Then he said her name. Not loudly, not aggressively. He simply said her name in a conversational tone, as though they had arranged to meet here and she was slightly late, and something about the normalcy of it made the fear arrive faster than it might have otherwise. She stopped walking. She asked who was there. He stepped forward into the thin light coming from a window above, and she saw his face, and her body understood before her mind fully caught up. Her heart rate spiked. Her hands went cold. She felt the particular, nauseating quality of a fear that has been anticipated intellectually suddenly becoming physical and immediate and real. Ryan Cole was standing in her alleyway. She had never given him her address. She had never told him which neighborhood she lived in, which street, which building. She had been careful about that specifically, deliberately, from the very beginning, and he was standing 12 feet away from her in the dark outside her home. He moved before she could speak.
His hand closed around her throat with a speed and certainty that suggested he had thought carefully about exactly this moment, exactly this sequence of movements. He slammed her backward into the wall hard enough that the impact registered through her entire spine, and then he held her there, with her feet barely finding the ground and his face close to hers, studying her with an expression that contained no anger, which was somehow worse than anger. He was calm. He was deliberate. He asked who she had been with. He asked why she was out so late. He asked whether the person who dropped her off was a man. Sarah couldn't answer, not because she chose silence, but because his grip on her throat had reduced her breathing to something thin and insufficient, each attempt at air arriving smaller than the last. Tears ran down her face without her deciding to cry. Her hands went to his arm instinctively and found it completely immovable. He tightened his grip further. She looked past him at the black rectangle of sky above the alley walls, and her mind went somewhere quiet and strange, the way minds apparently do when the body is approaching its limit. She thought about her childhood dog, a golden retriever named Percy, who had died 3 years ago, and the thought arrived with such unexpected clarity and warmth that she felt herself almost smile despite everything. And perhaps because of the smile, perhaps because something in her expression surprised him, Ryan let go. He stepped back. For one moment, he looked at her with something unreadable crossing his face. Then he looked at his phone and said almost to himself that he had to leave. The last bus was in 3 minutes. He turned and walked quickly toward the end of the alleyway without looking back, and Sarah slid down the wall to the cold, wet ground and stayed there, trying to pull air into her body in sufficient quantities to keep herself conscious. She called James. She couldn't speak. Her vocal cords had been compressed too severely to produce anything beyond a thin, strange sound that she barely recognized as coming from herself. James heard the sound and said he was already on his way. At his apartment, she fell asleep on his couch within minutes, the complete physical shutdown of a body that had used everything it had. While she slept, James called the police. The next morning, he drove her to the station where she gave her statement in full. The months of messages, the threats, the screenshots she had kept without fully knowing why, and everything that had happened in the alleyway. The police listened carefully. When they finished questioning her, they told her that her situation was serious enough that they weren't comfortable letting her leave without protection. They gave her a personal alarm and a tracking device with direct alert capability that would notify officers of her precise location the moment she pressed it. They told her they believed Ryan would come back. He did, in a manner of speaking. 3 days later, Sarah was followed on her way to meet a friend, a man she later understood to be someone who knew Ryan, running some kind of advanced surveillance. The friend who picked her up had arrived early without being asked to, and Sarah believed with quiet certainty that the timing had been different by 10 minutes. The story would have ended in that second encounter rather than continuing. The police told her plainly what they believed Ryan's intention had been from the beginning. Sarah now carries the alarm everywhere. She checks the street before she leaves her building. She takes different routes at different times. She is watchful in the specific, exhausting way of someone who has learned that danger doesn't always announce itself, that sometimes it adds you back on Snapchat with a soft message about your smile and stands in your alleyway speaking your name in a perfectly ordinary voice, and waits. She wrote everything down because she wanted it to exist somewhere outside of herself, because she understood that documentation is sometimes the only form of control available, and because she knew that if something happens to her, she wanted people to understand exactly how it unfolded, not as something random or sudden, but as something that had been patient and deliberate and taken its time.
Tom Calloway had been planning the trip for 3 weeks, which wasn't really planning so much as deciding and then not undeciding. He picked a weekend in October because October in the Appalachians was supposed to be the best time to go. The leaves at peak color, the summer crowds already gone, the air cool enough to make hiking feel like something worth doing rather than something to survive. He told his coworker Brett about it on a Monday, and Brett said it sounded like exactly the kind of thing Tom needed, which was true. Tom had been running on empty for months, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix, that weekends don't touch, that accumulates quietly in the background of a life until one day you notice it sitting in every room of your apartment with you. He needed to be outside. He needed quiet. He needed the specific reset that only comes from being somewhere without cell service and without anyone expecting anything from you. He packed his gear on a Friday night. Tent, sleeping bag, compact cooking kit, 2 days of food, a headlamp, and a first aid kit he had owned for 4 years and never opened. He had done solo trips before, not frequently, but enough times to feel competent about it. He knew how to read a trail, how to set up camp before dark, how to manage a fire responsibly. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't the kind of person who went into the woods unprepared and expected nature to accommodate him. He was careful, experienced enough, and completely alone in the way he had specifically chosen to be. He left before sunrise on Saturday and drove most of the day south, the mountains assembling themselves gradually on the horizon over the last 2 hours of the drive, growing from suggestions into something solid and serious against the October sky. He stopped for food at a roadside diner about 90 minutes from his destination, a small, low-lit place with vinyl booth seats and a handwritten specials board, and a kind of institutional coffee that arrives in a white mug before you ask for it. The place was mostly empty, a couple of older men at a corner table, a waitress who moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been working the same room for 20 years. Tom sat at the counter and ordered a burger and studied a trail map on his phone while he waited. He didn't notice the man at first. He was sitting 3 stools down, somewhere in his 50s, weathered in the way that suggested outdoor work rather than outdoor recreation, with a canvas jacket and hands that looked like they'd spent decades doing something difficult. He wasn't doing anything strange. He was drinking coffee and looking at the counter. But at some point, Tom became aware that the man was glancing in his direction with a regularity that went slightly beyond casual curiosity. Tom didn't react. People noticed strangers in small places. It was ordinary. Then the man spoke. He asked, without much preamble, where Tom was headed. Tom told him, camping up in the mountains, a solo trip, a couple of nights. The man nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're processing something rather than agreeing with it. Then he said Tom should be careful out there. Tom asked what he meant by that. The man looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Then he said, "It gets real quiet out there at night." He said it without drama, without the performative gravity of someone trying to be mysterious. He said it the way you'd mention that a particular road had bad visibility in the rain, as simple, practical information offered without expectation of thanks. Then he went back to his coffee and didn't say anything else. Tom paid his bill and left. He thought about the comment for maybe 10 minutes on the highway before the mountains filled his windshield completely and the thought dissolved. By late afternoon, he reached the dirt pull-off where he planned to leave his car, a small clearing near a trailhead with no other vehicles and no signage beyond a weathered wooden post marking the trail entrance. The absence of other cars registered briefly as something to note, and then was filed away under the category of things that were actually fine. Tom liked being alone. That was the whole point. He shouldered his pack and started hiking in. The trail was manageable, but took longer than his map suggested, partly because the light faded faster under tree cover than in open air, and partly because he stopped twice to check his bearings when the path narrowed and grew less obvious. By the time he found a clearing suitable for camp, the sky through the canopy had gone the deep blue-gray of late dusk, and the woods around him had already begun their transition into something different. The same trees, the same ground, but altered by the loss of light into a version of themselves that felt less familiar and less friendly. He set up quickly, working with focused efficiency of someone racing the dark. Tent first, staked properly despite the time pressure, because a poorly staked tent was a problem he didn't want at midnight. Sleeping bag inside, pack secured, fire circle cleared of debris and built carefully with the dry wood he collected from the immediate area before the light went entirely. When the fire caught and steadied,
He sat back and let himself arrive. It was genuinely beautiful. The fire threw warm light against the nearest trees, and the darkness beyond them had the soft, total quality of darkness that only exists far from artificial light. The sounds were the right sounds. Insects, a light movement of air through branches, the occasional distant creak of a large tree shifting its weight. He made food, ate slowly, and felt the specific unwinding of someone who had been tightly coiled for too long, finally being allowed to release. He was reaching for his water bottle when he heard the footsteps. They were not animal footsteps. Animals move with a rhythm and randomness that becomes recognizable once you've spent enough time outside. The quick scatter of something small, the deliberate, careful placement of something large. These were different. These were the footsteps of something that walked upright, that distributed its weight the way a person does, that moved through dry leaves with the specific cadence of a human being walking at a measured, unhurried pace. Tom looked up. There was a man standing at the tree line, 30 feet maybe, 40, standing completely still in the gap between two large oaks, facing the fire, facing Tom. His face was in shadow. The firelight reached far enough to confirm his shape and his stillness, but not far enough to show his expression or his eyes. He was simply there, in the way that something can be simply there when it has been standing in one place long enough to become part of the landscape before you noticed it. Tom's first instinct was to speak, because speaking is what people do when they want to believe something is ordinary. He called out and asked if the man was all right. The man stepped forward, one step, just enough to bring him marginally closer to the edge of the firelight. He said, "Hello," a single word delivered with no warmth or hostility, without the apologetic friendliness of a fellow camper who knows he startled someone. Just hello, flat and patient, like the opening move in something Tom didn't yet understand the rules of. Tom asked if he was camping nearby. The man didn't answer his question. Instead, he asked one of his own, delivered in the same flat, patient tone. He asked if Tom was out there alone. The fire crackled between them. Somewhere deeper in the woods behind the man, something shifted in the leaves, a sound too brief and too distant to identify, there and then gone. Tom looked at the man's face, still mostly in shadow, and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the October air. He told the man his friends were meeting him soon. The man nodded slowly. He accepted this information with the unhurried calm of someone who had already formed his own conclusions and was content to let Tom keep his. Then he turned without a word and walked back into the trees, his shape fading with each step until the darkness absorbed him completely. Tom watched the tree line until he was certain the man was gone. Then he sat very still beside his fire and listened to the woods, and the woods listened back. And somewhere in the dark beyond the reach of the firelight, something that might have been movement stopped being movement and became stillness, and Tom could not tell where the man ended and the night began.
Tom put the fire out around 10. He told himself this was normal. Fire management, responsible camping, nothing more. He told himself this even as his hands moved faster than they needed to, and his eyes kept pulling toward the tree line with a frequency that had nothing to do with casual awareness and everything to do with the specific animal alertness of something that believes it is being watched. He smothered the last of the embers, zipped the tent behind him, and lay on top of his sleeping bag, fully clothed, with his headlamp switched off and his ears doing the work his eyes no longer could. The woods were quiet in the way they had been quiet before the man appeared, which meant the quiet itself had stopped feeling like peace and started feeling like a held breath. Tom told himself he was overreacting. He ran through the rational explanation methodically, the way you might check a list. The man was another camper. Solo hikers cross paths all the time, especially at dusk when people were still settling into their sites. The question about whether Tom was alone was strange, yes, but strange didn't mean dangerous. Strange meant curious or socially awkward or slightly drunk on camping whiskey. The man had left when Tom spoke. He had walked away without argument or aggression. There was nothing concrete to be afraid of. Tom believed about 40% of this. He lay in the dark and listened, and the minutes moved slowly in the way they do when you are trying to measure them without looking at a clock. At some point, he felt himself beginning to drift, not sleep exactly, but the loose, unguarded place at its edge where the body starts making decisions the conscious mind hasn't signed off on yet. Then he heard the footsteps. Close, significantly closer than before. Not at the tree line, but within the campsite itself, moving through the leaves that surrounded his tent with a slowness that was worse than speed, because speed at least suggests urgency, and urgency suggests something that will pass. This was patient. This was the movement of something that was not in a hurry because it had nowhere else to be and all night to be there. The footsteps moved in a circle around the tent. Tom stopped breathing without deciding to. He lay completely rigid, listening to the slow revolution of steps around the thin fabric that separated him from whoever was outside, and he understood with terrible clarity that the tent, which had felt like shelter 10 minutes ago, now felt like a very small room with no lock on the door. The steps completed one full circuit and stopped directly outside the entrance. Silence. Not the ambient silence of the woods at night, but a targeted, deliberate silence. The silence of someone standing still and choosing to be quiet. Tom could feel the specific pressure of another person's proximity even through the tent wall, the way air changes when a body is close to it. He pressed himself flat and did not move and did not make a sound and counted seconds because it was the only thing available to him that felt like control. After a long time, he couldn't have said how long, the footsteps moved away. He heard them fade gradually into the leaves and then disappear into the larger silence of the woods. Tom exhaled. He waited. Then he waited longer. Then he allowed himself very slowly to believe it was over. 10 minutes later, the footsteps came back. This went on for hours, the same slow circle around the tent, the same stop at the entrance, the same weighted silence, the same gradual retreat. Sometimes the steps faded far enough that Tom started to believe the person had finally gone, that the night had run its course and whatever this was had ended. Then they would return, patient and unhurried as before, as though distance were simply another form of waiting. Once, during a longer silence, Tom heard something that rearranged every explanation he had been trying to maintain, a sound from a different direction than the circling footsteps. Somewhere to his left, further into the trees, a branch shifted under weight. Something settling, something stationary. Not moving away, just standing, which meant the person circling the tent was not the only person in the woods. Tom lay in the dark with this understanding and felt it move through him like cold water finding its level. He thought about the tent zipper, how loud it would sound in the silence if he opened it, how completely it would announce that he was awake and aware. He thought about his headlamp and what it would mean to turn it on. He thought about every decision that had brought him to this specific clearing on this specific night, and he thought about the man in the diner with his weathered hands and his coffee cup saying, "It gets real quiet out there at night," and understanding now that it had not been a casual observation. He did not sleep. He was not capable of sleep. He lay still and performed stillness and waited for the sky to change, and the sky took a very long time to change. The first gray suggestion of dawn came through the tent fabric as a barely perceptible lightening, less a color than the absence of complete darkness, gradual and tentative. Tom watched it arrive with the focused desperation of someone who has attached their sense of safety to a specific outcome and cannot look away from it. When the light was sufficient, not bright, just present, he started to move. He packed with shaking hands, stuffing rather than folding, prioritizing speed over order in a way that his careful, methodical nature made feel almost physically painful. He didn't eat. He didn't boil water. He unzipped the tent with one motion and stepped outside into the gray pre-dawn light of a forest that looked entirely ordinary and felt entirely wrong. He heard them run. Not one set of footsteps, multiple. At least 3, possibly more, bursting simultaneously from different points around the campsite and moving fast and deep into the woods in different directions. He couldn't see them. The trees swallowed them before his eyes could find them, but the sound was absolutely, irreversibly clear. The sound of several people who had been standing in the dark around his tent, close and patient through the long hours of the night, now scattering at the first sign that he was leaving. Tom grabbed his pack and ran. He didn't look behind him. He found the trail by memory and instinct and pushed hard through the gray morning light,
branches catching his jacket and his boots finding rocks he couldn't see properly, and his lungs burning with cold air and exertion and something beyond both of those things. He reached his car, got inside, locked the doors, and sat there shaking with the engine running until exhaustion pulled him under, and he slept slumped against the window for several hours without meaning to. When he woke, the sun was high, and the parking area looked unremarkable and safe in the way that daylight makes everything look unremarkable and safe. He sought for a while, and let the ordinariness of it settle over him. Then, because he had left gear behind in his rush, and because the rational part of his brain had not entirely stopped functioning, he made a decision he would regret within minutes of acting on it. He went back. He told himself it was daylight. He told himself that whatever happened in the dark was a function of the dark, and that the woods in full morning sun were simply woods. He walked back down the trail with the confidence of someone trying very hard to feel confident, and when he reached the area where his campsite had been, he stopped walking and stood completely still. The tent was gone. The sleeping bag was gone. The cooking kit, the remaining food, the stakes pulled cleanly from the ground. Everything gone. The only evidence that anyone had ever been there was the black circle of ash from his fire, sitting in the center of an otherwise empty clearing like a period at the end of a sentence. Tom walked the perimeter of the area slowly, checking his orientation against the trees and rocks he remembered, making absolutely certain he had the right location. He had the right location. He knew every landmark. This was his campsite, and everything he had left behind had been removed with a thoroughness and a neatness that was more disturbing than destruction would have been. Destruction is rage. This was method. This was several people working deliberately and quietly in the dark, in the hours when they believed he was asleep, removing every trace of his presence with the practiced efficiency of people who had done something like this before. Tom turned around and walked back to his car without stopping and without looking into the trees. He drove home the same day. He didn't file a report. He didn't call anyone until he was back in his apartment with the door locked and the lights on, and even then he only told one person, and only once, and in the particular quiet voice of someone describing something they are deciding whether to believe happened to them. He hasn't camped alone since. He's thought about going back with other people in daylight to the same trailhead, not to find anything or prove anything, just to stand in a place in the sun and make it ordinary again. He hasn't done it yet. Sometimes, on bad nights, he thinks about how many people were actually standing in that darkness around his tent, how close they were, how long they stayed, how carefully and completely they cleaned up after themselves when the night was over, leaving nothing behind except the ash of a fire and the certainty, settled deep and permanent in Tom Calloway's chest, that the woods had been watching him long before he ever noticed anyone standing at the tree line.